Good afternoon. Just waiting a couple of minutes to give people a chance to get in. Always takes a little bit of time. Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to this EPC policy dialogue on taking stock 1 year after the trade agreement, the trade and cooperation agreement to be precise. I'm Fabian Zuleeg. I'm going to be chairing today's discussion, and I might also be tempted to say a couple of things while we go along. And I'm very glad we're having this panel discussion today, which is part of the EUIdea project. It's a good time, I think, to take stock a year into the TCA, but certainly not into a settled and stable relationship. I think that's something we can discuss further in the next hour and a half or so. I just wrote a little blog which will be published in a few days, where I was talking about bad, worse, or catastrophic. The relationship at the moment doesn't seem to be in a very good place, but I actually fear that there might be scope for even a deterioration from where we are now, maybe even as far to go towards some form of collapse of the agreement, which we spent quite a bit of time negotiating. There are a number of issues where there's friction on Northern Ireland, on migration, on fisheries, and certainly also in the trading relationship. Things have changed and they're not necessarily going very smoothly. So to look into all of that, I'm looking very much forward to the discussion. I'll introduce the panelists as we go along, but just to say, I want to make this as much as a conversation as possible. So I would also encourage the audience to either raise your electronic hand if you want to come in, or to write your questions in the question and answer box. If you do have a question, please keep it short. It's very difficult to read out very long questions, so short is better, but I will try to get to all of the questions as we go along. But we'll kick off with a short introduction of where we are at from Richard Szostak, who is the Deputy Secretary General in the EU Commission, responsible for the EU-UK relationship now. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Fabian. You just promoted me there,
Cool.
but I am touched and flattered, given we have spoken before. But there you go. So yes, I'm in charge of the implementation of the two agreements within the relevant part of the SecGen. And Fabian, you asked me to make a few introductory comments, and really I'd have four kind of general remarks to make to kick off this discussion. The first one is that with the trade and cooperation agreement, you have an agreement which is extraordinary in terms of its breadth, covering fisheries to police cooperation and so forth. And in that sense, it's a broader agreement than what we usually do in the European Union. But as regards its depth, it follows very much classical agreements with third countries of the kind that you have in trade, transport, other areas of cooperation. So of course there are exceptions to that. But overall, we see the trade and cooperation, of course, as a very important agreement, but one which is very, very broad, but one which is not necessarily so deep. And the lack of depth is primarily the result of the multiple red lines that the UK has drawn in the course of the negotiation, and red lines which continue to be relevant to this day and will continue to be in the future. In terms of its implementation, as far as we're concerned, large parts are relatively uncontentious and the implementation is going fine. And so it coincides with many areas where the Commission has ample experience in terms of implementation. For example, the free trade agreement part, the air transport agreement, the PNR agreement, and so forth. And the main challenge that we've seen relates in particular to fisheries, which is economically quite small, but politically extremely sensitive. So that was my first point. My second point is that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is, of course, legally distinct from the Withdrawal Agreement, even if there is a cross-reference between the two on areas related to good faith. But politically, we see the two agreements as going together as a kind of as a package, two agreements which form the basis of future relations in between the EU and the UK. And when the dynamic that we see in our interactions with the UK is that the UK is trying to do the opposite. Their narrative is, or at least the way that we see their narrative is, everything is fine except this one kind of protocol that needs revisiting. And this is a narrative, an approach, and a way of thinking that doesn't work for us. So that was the second point that I wanted to make. The third point that I'd like to make is that the breadth and the depth of EU-UK relations are now defined by the TCA, by the negotiation as completed in the course of last year. In other words, what we don't see at the moment is a kind of a plug-in logic where we plug in additional modules over time. In other words, on issues where no agreement was found in the TCA, and as I mentioned at the beginning, usually as a result of the red lines and the consequences of those red lines on the UK side. So on mobility, for example, we don't see much of a change in the foreseeable future. So we don't see now kind of every time we see a problem arise or friction arising in the UK-EU relationship in a particular area covered by the protocol, we don't see the solution as being that additional elements should be plugged into the TCA in order to address that problem. The fourth point, and this is more looking ahead, are what we see as being the main challenges in respect to the TCA. The first one is implementing the level playing field provisions of the TCA. We see potentially 2022 to be the year of divergence in between the EU and the UK, and the level playing field provisions of the TCA are the ones that we need to implement in order to address that. Secondly, we see fisheries continuing to be a difficult area of discussion in 2022. And EU internally, what we'll have to look at is how to manage kind of bilateral discussions, agreements, MOUs that the member states enter into with the UK at their level. My job description, Fabian, remains to bring relations in between the EU and the UK onto a stable and constructive and sustainable footing. And if that's the spirit with which we approach all the work that we do, both under the Trade and Cooperation and the Withdrawal Agreement, unfortunately, that's proving to be much more difficult than we had expected or we had hoped. But certainly on the side of the Commission, you have a bunch of people who will be trying to avoid the kind of negative scenarios which you described in your introduction. That's it from me, Fabian. I hope that was helpful.
Thanks very much, Richard, and apologies for the little hiccup at the beginning. You shouldn't always trust what you read on the internet. There are a number of things I would like to come back to, but I want to bring the other two also into the conversation. I'll start with Anna. Anna Jerzewska, who is the founder and director of Trade and Borders. At the heart of the TCA is, of course, the trading relationship. And it would be interesting to hear your reflections on how you think that has developed after the TCA was put into place, whether this is what we would have expected, whether things have gone better or worse, and where you see the main impacts in the implementation so far.
Thank you very much, Fabian. Thank you for the invitation. Another surname difficult to pronounce on the panel. In terms of the TCA, I think there's a bit of a disconnect between the kind of the politics of it all and what's happening on the ground and practice, as one would expect, and as we often see with these agreements. While we're not technically in the process of negotiating, well, we are on the protocol, but we don't technically, the TCA is in place. The Brexit process, the formal part of the process is technically over. However, as we mentioned, the relationship is still developing, and there is perhaps there are perhaps reasons why you would want to present something in one way or the other to the general public, but the politics of this discussion, the way it's currently being done, as you mentioned in your initial comments, means that the relationship is not great. The bilateral relationship at the moment is deteriorating, and it's not helpful on the ground for traders. It's not helpful for companies. What's happening on the ground, in terms of a trading relationship, the more cooperation, the more goodwill, the more mutual kind of assistance, joint initiatives, cooperation, the better it is for companies, and the easier it is to deal with such a massive change that happened on the border. So the impact on the ground has been quite significant. We obviously have had a very different approach to this change on both sides of the border. So EU implemented all the changes, all the border controls, almost all border controls on day one, and everything was in place, everything was ready. On the UK side, obviously UK had much more to do, given that it had to redesign the process to a large extent. But this has been staged. So I think one of the impacts was the fact that just general confusion around what this process is like on both sides. If you send something to the UK, you have one set of rules. If you send something to the EU from the UK, you have a different set of rules. And it takes quite a lot of time for even the people that do this on a daily basis to keep up with what's happening, with the changes and so on. So if you're talking about a company that is mainly focused on making things work and being profitable, this is not an easy task. So I'll just finish by saying that obviously, as you would expect, a new border, new formalities means that it's more difficult and more expensive to trade between the two. And that has very much been felt by both companies on the UK side as well as companies on the EU side.
And can I just ask, because there's a narrative in the UK, you sometimes hear about teething problems. This is all just something which will happen because it needs to settle down, and in the longer run things will be smoother. Is that something you see? These are teething problems, or is this more indicative of the longer term relationship?
I mean, that narrative is a very double-edged sword, and because if you say teething problems, then if you're prepared and have everything in place on time, then you have less of a kind of initial change. I think that there's definitely something to be said for the timing of it all. The fact that we got the deal on Christmas, there was no chance for anyone to be fully ready with such short notice. So I think there's definitely an element of that, but I think that's to do with companies being maybe, some goods being turned away at the border, so on. The amount of internal work and the additional cost, that is not going away. That's not part of an initial adjustment. That is here to stay. So yes, there was some initial confusion and some initial kind of getting your head around what the processes are, but there's also a long-term impact that will cause supply chains to shift and businesses to respond.
Thanks, Anna. Now bringing in also Kalypso. Kalypso Nicolaïdis, who is Professor of International Relations at Oxford University. What about the long-term impact on the politics? Where do you see the EU-UK relationship? And is what we are seeing now, in your view, indicative of what to expect in the longer term as well?
Hello, Fabian
Hello.
and Richard and Anna. Just to say, I'm speaking from Florence because I'm now a chair at the School of Transnational Governance on leave from Oxford. I would say, sadly or not, but it gives me a bit of recul vis-a-vis Brexit, in which I have been plunged for so many years as an expat and then British citizen. And perhaps it's this little story of mine leads me to be a bit more optimistic than, for one, Fabian's bad to worse, quite ominous blog. I can't wait to read it, Fabian. But I do note that Richard said in passing at the end, well, we're trying to make this work. And of course, it's Richard's work to make it work. It's his job, but I would say that I believe that this is a shared sentiment when one speaks to Whitehall or around the UK. In the UK too, and Anna was, rightly pointing to all the costs. Of course, publicly they're not recognized. Of course, they tend to be hidden under the very useful veil of COVID. But we know that you're asking, Fabian, the question of a bit in the longer term. If this year was the transition where you could kind of fudge the costs, and where, each side is actually committed, I think, one way or another, to what I would call demonstrative transition. Each side, I think rightly, it's not a reproach, needs to demonstrate something in the transition. You were calling this, Fabian, teething problems. I think it's necessary to have such a transition, but I also believe that there is a sense that it's past its sell-by date, or rather we get to the second year and we're on business. And Richard's team is amazing. They're working really hard, and I think they're facing very serious teams on the other side too. Now, of course, there had to be demonstration transition. The UK's demand for sovereignty actually is not original to the UK. It's all over Europe and in the world. Is also demand for the state under COVID, for leveling up, all of these things. They're there, and it's more important in the UK than anything else. And in the EU, demonstrating that leaving is not the same as being in. Now the UK likes to say, hey, that's revenge. No, it's a normal thing. You don't have the same advantage. And this needs to be shown to everyone inside the UK and outside. And so, and I would say the EU's approach has been very principled on this. But I also would argue that there is a recognition on both sides that, call it reset, call it reorientation, call it deepening, that it will be necessary. I don't think it's going to happen in the first part of next year. It will wait for Macron's re-election. for things settling down on the Johnson side on all of the problems there. But it will happen within this year when we have a conversation in a year's time. And I just want to, you know, Fabian, if you allow me then to comment on some of the points that Richard put on the table. So his first point was, hey, we're working, it's cool. Main challenges, tiny, fisheries. I do have a question there because about the process. You know, we know the UK says to France, well, 90% of your boats are accepted, but then the Commission is the one that filters the demands. So it's interesting for our public to understand how this actually works, because it's so escalated that at the beginning of COP26, when Europe should have been united like never before, we're talking about some boats. I understand they're very, very important. You know, the fishermen have a life. But I also do understand that the Commission vets their demands, that they're very technical issues, like if you have a new boat, is it accepted? But what if it brings in more fish? You know, it's quite technical. I mean, is it really the case that the Brits and the Commission disagree on all these things? I think it's quite technical. Secondly, your second point, Richard, was about the TCA and Northern Ireland. There is a real kind of semantic question here, you know, whether that is, the protocol is being revisited. Well, you have a committee, you're in it, right? It's a joint committee, you sit every day, you committed to that every day. What is the principle and what is the interpretation? Now, it's a kind of thing, you know, that seems a bit, woo, yo, who cares? But it's what it's all about in some ways, because the EU is saying, well, you know, the UK is contesting all these checks in the Irish Sea. They're contesting that, you know, if you have a truck, instead of one passport, one certification, you have 1,000 because you have 1,000 pallets. Instead of 90% of the goods being not at risk because they just go to Northern Ireland, no, well, there's less. So the UK says, well, this is interpretation. It's stuff we want to discuss deeply in the joint committee. The EU says, no, you're questioning the whole agreement. Now, you know, we could go along for a long time and kind of arguing on both sides, but one needs to then ask if it was a question of principle, and if the UK was entirely wrong about these numbers of checks in the Irish Sea and that they're disproportional, that there's about 20 times more checks in the Irish Sea than, I don't know, in the eastern border of the EU, all of these things. Fair enough. I don't like I'm an IR prof. I don't like countries questioning their signature on a treaty. Absolutely. Nobody likes it. Everybody condemns the UK. But we just saw 4 weeks ago, the EU Commission very, very rightly announcing headline news. 80%, we are going to decrease by 80% our checks in the North Irish Sea. Now, if there were no checks, no extra check, no problematic checks, why would the EU then accept to decrease by 80%, knowing that it's very rightly principled on this? So it's just a question on the Northern Ireland protocol, coming from someone who completely accepts the logic and applauds the logic that countries should implement their treaties. But the question is, how do we think about interpretation in a very, very delicate situation? 3, your third point, Richard, is on issues where no agreements are found. Please say you don't want to plug in anything else. Now, on this question of plug in, you're right that there is the question of indivisibility of the 4 freedom. I think that's what you meant by, well, we have these issues of mobility. But then the question is, you know, in the end, why not? If we understand that this agreement, extraordinary breadth, but not enough depth, and if the main red line is still mobility, and frankly, really annoying stuff on mobility, we could come back to this on the UK side. But nevertheless, Richard, wouldn't it be important to go much further, including on equivalence, which granted is a unilateral thing, but we know that while equivalence is unilateral, it's actually also a negotiation, thankfully. So, you know, professionals, musicians, all of these things, you know, all of these questions raised on the UK side that make the EU not look so good. And finally, your main challenges, implementation of the playing field, I think is, of course, such an important issue for the future. Take LPF, where actually, to me, if I may, I would like to frame this as a challenge for the EU, so that Brexit is a challenge for the EU as a model for multilateral trade negotiation in a post-COVID world. And I recently wrote a piece with Ignacio Bercero on the Europe's power surplus and how the EU best uses its extra power in the trade regulatory nexus in a way that is not complacent and in a way that really shows the world what the EU wants to be as a leader. And if that's the case, then I would say more cooperation rather than unilateralism, more respect for what I call, not respect, let's say implementation of legal empathy, the idea that we let goods and services in if the other side is compatible with us rather than necessarily aligned, which is part of the demand. In my view, the UK goes too far in many ways. The UK often these days speaks of divergence for the sake of divergence. Very annoying. Nevertheless, the question for the EU is whether and how it can engage with its neighbors like Norway and Switzerland and the UK, and then further afield by exercising a real commitment to regulatory compatibility, to legal empathy. And this applies and in a very principled ways, because we don't want free riders around the EU at a time when we are implementing the transition and where our industries that Anna was talking about are going to face bigger costs. But the question is then, when we look at the EU-UK discussions on subsidies, their news database, the new discussion on the subsidies bill, are we worried on the EU side? It's true that it's going to be more nimble, that they're going to commit to making decisions within 3 to 6 months, still to be negotiated in Westminster. Should we be worried? I mean, the EU is much more cumbersome and long, normal, 27 member states. But on the principles themselves, should we be worried? Question mark. Are we lacking a way to access these decisions ex ante, as we feared in the negotiation? I say we as the EU. That's a question. I mean, I'm watching these discussions, but I'm still kind of agnostic about them. So that's for level playing field. And we spoke about fishery, we spoke of MR. But I guess what I'm interested in here at this stage of our conversation, Fabian, is to ask, to come to this with an idea that everything is solvable in negotiation. You know, Richard's teams is amazing and brilliant. The UK is full of desire. They're never going to trigger Article 16, if you ask me, on the Northern Ireland Protocol. They want this to work. They don't want to mess at their door. We all face a world of geopolitical solitude for the EU, both UK and EU, I believe. And therefore, we need to stick together. So if we can't resolve TCA, how are we going to face Xi Jinping, Putin, and the geopolitical mess that this world is in?
Thanks, Kalypso. One could say if that logic was applied earlier, we wouldn't have Brexit. But I think I'll leave some of the specific questions also to Richard to answer. But maybe one of the themes which has already come through is this question of, yes, we negotiated something which is rather complex. We had a rather small amount of time to do it. Is there a need now to correct some of that? I know it hasn't been implemented for a very long time, but clearly you also see how certain things work in the implementation rather than in the run-up. And for the moment, at least, when it comes to fundamental questions, the EU argument seems to be, no, this is what was negotiated and we can't diverge from that. So maybe some comment on that. but of course also opening it up, and I will pick up some of the questions from the Q&A as well. But I'll give Richard a chance first to respond to some of the comments which have been made.
Sure, thank you very much. So maybe on the points on which I've heard so far. So first, the questions around fisheries. The reason, so on fisheries, of course, the role of the Commission is to assess what the TCA on fisheries, the provisions of which are new, actually means, and listen very carefully to what the French have to say, agree on what reasonably can be asked of the UK, and then try to ensure that whatever the Commission and the French agree ought to be requested of the UK is delivered. So the Commission, I think, is not a kind of an unthinking vessel which just passes French requests on to the UK. It's also an actor in this process, an actor which is there to protect the interests of a member state. So that's how I'd characterize the discussion. Now, the way in which the UK has chosen to manage this process is with a system of, at least in some areas, of temporary licenses, which can last for 3-month periods or 1-month periods and roll over in this kind of a way. Each license being the livelihood of a fisherman and his or her family, and that creates kind of regularly cliff edges where temporary licenses expire. There's no guarantee given in advance of whether they'll be prolonged, and that then creates kind of regular points at which there is a drama. And this is what kind of explains the regular increases in tension in between the EU and the UK on this topic. In addition, there are a couple of areas on territorial waters and on replacement vessels where there have been requests for licenses outstanding for a very long time, in some cases up to a year, and where no decision is forthcoming. And this is where the kind of the great frustration arises on the EU side. And Kalypso, I take slight issue with the way you describe the Northern Irish question, because the issue is not that the UK contests the way in which the EU interprets the withdrawal agreement and the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland. The issue is that the UK wants to renegotiate, or at least wanted to renegotiate, the withdrawal agreement, and therefore refuses any kind of proper implementation of it. If you look at the command paper, which was published in July, that would have required a complete rewrite, a fundamental rewrite of the relevant protocol on governance, on substantive provisions, everything. And that was accompanied by an unwillingness to respect either the original, well, the protocol, or even the terms of the grace periods which were agreed with the UK. And so this really is a fundamental problem. And the response from the Commission in that context was to say that we always knew that the implementation of this protocol would be difficult. We've listened very carefully to what stakeholders in Northern Ireland had to say. And we put forward a series of facilitations which we think can be implemented without endangering the single market. So we said to the UK, if you place yourself in a logic of facilitating the implementation of the protocol rather than rewriting it completely, we can work with you. What we don't accept is you saying either you renegotiate the treaty or we threaten the integrity of the single market by triggering Article 16. That was I'd say the parameter of the discussion. And our choice was to say, well, we listen to what people are saying in Northern Ireland, and we try to address the genuine difficulties in ways which are safe from the perspective of the integrity of the single market. Then there was the question, well, why don't we start kind of plugging additional things in? And the reason is that we don't think, so we knew that the red lines that the UK drew in the negotiations of the TCA would create a series of practical problems for touring artists. I mean, we didn't necessarily foresee the touring artists, but the choices made by the UK would have certain consequences. And we don't think it's our role now, every time a problem does come up, which creates political difficulties for the UK, to start trying to solve the UK's problem on its behalf. I mean, there is a point at which we have to say, especially given the UK's position on the Northern Ireland Protocol, to say you simply have to face up to the consequences of your choices. Maybe that position will change sometime in the future, but at this point in time, given the overall political atmospherics, we don't think that an alternative policy line would work. So then on questions of divergence, I mean the example that is kind of most clear in my mind is around data protection and the adequacy decision. And here, so we don't have, so the EU took an adequacy decision in respect of the UK. It has it's the first decision of its kind, which includes a kind of a commitment to review the application of it within 4 years, and certainly to do so as soon as the UK internal legislation changes. So far, we've only seen kind of documents, sets of ideas. I'm not sure what exactly kind of white paper style in our language, documents being consulted upon publicly. But what you really see in that process is kind of the UK kind of testing the outer limits of what it could do to create a lighter burden and potentially a competitive advantage for itself, but not in such a brutal way that the UK would necessarily, so the EU would necessarily remove its adequacy decision. And so you see, what we see is just a process of that limit being tested. And of course, what our job is to see, is to work out, what we would be prepared to accept or not accept. But that, I think, is a bit of a case study in what we might expect in the future. Then you made the point about whether everything is solvable and whether the UK government sees its political advantage as being finding consensual solutions with the UK, or whether its advantage is to be more confrontational. Maybe the answer is that it depends on the area. There are areas in the UK-EU relationship which are going broadly speaking, okay. Citizens, let's never forget that that's probably the most important single part of this. But the rights of 5 million citizens, that's going pretty much okay. But kind of the intentions of the UK government are probably not for me to comment upon. But let's hope you're right. Let's just put it that way.
Thanks, Richard. Let's stay with Northern Ireland for a little bit, and I'll turn to Anna as well, because I mean, obviously we have a different regime in Northern Ireland than we have for the rest of the UK. What kind of impact is that having? And also, what I would like you to speculate a bit on is what might happen in future if we are talking about particularly more significant divergence between the UK and the EU. What kind of impact could that have, particularly on trade in Northern Ireland?
Thank you very much. A small question and easy to answer, obviously. Northern Ireland in general is a very obviously difficult and sensitive topic, and I would kind of echo a lot of what Richard said about the protocol, that looking at the text when it was first published, looking at the text, obviously it's a substantial text. It addresses a number of areas and it covered a lot of topics. However, looking at it from a border management perspective, from a customs perspective, from a trade perspective, it left most of the questions unanswered. And and again, that's not necessarily unusual. This is something we see with international trade agreements all the time. They're negotiated on a political level rather than on a technical level, but they have to work on a technical level and have to be implemented on the ground. And very often there is some disconnect between those two levels, but it's not often as sensitive and as delicate as in this particular case. So what Richard said, that there were always going to be difficulties in implementation of that protocol, absolutely, I'd agree. The decision of the Joint Committee, which was supposed to kind of fix those and answer these unanswered questions about the implementation, that again, due to the quality or the kind of the difficulties with the negotiation process, that was left until the most difficult decisions were left until, again, very last minute, and they were published fairly late, and they again did not address a lot of these problems. And then coming to border checks and border formalities, there's so much that the border does in this case, and we have SPS checks for plant and animal products, food and so on, and then we have customs checks. Throughout this process, there were a number of kind of issues that I've been wondering about. So, for example, the fact that the EU is so, for obvious reasons, vocal about the need to protect the integrity of the single market. And it's important to remember that the EU has other members and other trading partners, and as always, and it's not EU specific in any way, as does the UK, but making concessions for one of your trading partners leads to potentially other trading partners having some questions or having some requests that you may or may not wish to accommodate. But with the EU being so clear about the need to protect the integrity of its integral market, of its single market, one thing that I've always been wondering is whether at any point the UK will realize that there is a need for tracking what's coming the other way. If there is, you mentioned divergence, if there's a significant divergence going forward, if we have a number of, by we I mean here the UK, of independent trade deals with countries where there are some sensitivities or some very different regimes in certain areas, with obvious examples in mind. What does it mean, the fact that everything that comes from NI into GB isn't tracked, isn't checked, and so on? Would the UK at some point not want to start collecting some data? I'm not even talking about checks and controls, but even just data, even knowing what's moving back and forth. We've seen, especially when it comes to smaller traders, it's a very easy equation. If you're sending something from the EU to the UK, you have, especially after the 1st of January, you have customs formalities, you have checks. If you're sending something to NI and from NI to GB, you don't. That is definitely a reality. So I think that coming back to kind of the state of the relationship and what's happening with the negotiations, I think the latest EU proposal was actually incredibly far-reaching. Again, we've not seen all the details. It still talks about simplifying customs procedures, and we think we know what we're talking about here. We think we're talking about the simplified customs declaration with less fields and less information needed to be provided, but we're not actually sure. So it seems very far-reaching. It seems like something that the EU has not necessarily offered to any of its trading partners so far. But again, as we all know, as Richard mentioned, that's not where the conversation is. That's not where the problem is. It's somewhere completely different on a political level. It seems that the EU has engaged with local communities, local businesses, local stakeholders, and that the proposal addresses the problems that companies and stakeholders are seeing on the ground. So I'd really like to see some proper discussion about this proposal and focusing on fixing these issues rather than the ongoing discussion about the role and the oversight, the role of the ECJ and the oversight of that protocol, because that seems a little bit stuck. So in terms of speculating about the future, that's not it's not part of my job description. I try not to speculate. The more divergence, the more that's one kind of truism about borders. The more divergence, the more need for controls. SPS obviously is, and I'm in no way an expert or qualified to talk about SPS, but SPS is one of those sensitive issues where if the EU starts making exceptions, despite the EU diverging, there will be some follow-up conversations with other trading partners. Because these rules, as strict and as restrictive as they are, they don't only apply to the UK, they apply to all EU's trading partners. So I think both sides need to be kind of respective of the fact that these discussions are not taking place in the vacuum. As much as we think it's only our conversation and we're the only ones following Brexit, I think other trading partners, both of the EU as well as of the UK, are keeping a close eye on the developments and any exceptions, any facilitations offered to the UK.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. In part, based on that, I wanted to also challenge Kalypso a little bit, because what you were talking about is, in a sense, there's a logic to cooperation, especially in a contested global environment. And that in the longer term, there has to be this logic. And that for that reason, the UK is not going to trigger Article 16. For me, there seems to be a very strong disconnect between that kind of cooperative logic, the economic logic, which is behind cooperation as well, and what is happening on the ground, where a lot seems to be about ideology, that sovereignty is the token for that ideology, that cooperation with the EU is bad in any form, and also an inability to admit that the choices which were made also have consequences, and that these consequences will be difficult. It will be difficult to explain to the unionist community in Northern Ireland that there are consequences, and that the UK government is not willing to go and do this. So one of the worries I have, for example, is that even if we get an agreement on these concrete measures to fix things in Northern Ireland as far as possible, that this is not going to be supported by the UK government, so that the frictions which are there on the ground will continue, the political friction, because as Anna was saying, economically, trading, it looks a bit different. So I'm not sure I share your optimism because of that focus on ideology on not being able to admit what choices have been taken.
Fabian, I would even add to what you just said that in fact, this ideologically driven set of positions that are sometimes, don't face material interest. Where are the good old Tories? We've all been bemoaning the fact that the CBI even can't get its point across, and that, Boris Johnson talks about piggy bears and whatever, when he talks to them. I mean, it's a very strange world. It is a very strange world. At what cost sovereignty, we're all asking and shaking our heads in disbelief. Because at the end of the day, this UK government needs a lot of taxes to do its leveling up in the north. So how is it going to do it when it kind of seems to put ideology before everything else? So I'm with you. And one of the translation in Northern Ireland that we see in polls that are fascinating is the lack of trust from Northern Ireland businesses that Anna was talking about vis-a-vis the UK government. I mean, this is not a love-in. There's real lack of trust, and there was very much discontent in the response of the UK government to the Commission proposals when they put forward the ECJ. Nobody cares in Northern Ireland business for ECJ or not ECJ. Probably there will be a fudge there with panels and ECJ overlaps on overlooking the oversight on interpretation of EU law. I mean, I think it's possible, but it's very interesting to see the bewilderment in Northern Ireland that this becomes the most important thing, whereas what they really care about is checks, the concrete impact on their everyday life. So this is to add, and even to add on what you say, Fabian, that you read the integrated review on the UK and the world, where the EU is totally absent, although France and some individual countries do appear here and there. I think France 9 times, but okay. So this is a phase. It's kind of slightly childish, really, to write an integrated review, which has a lot of really interesting points, and without mentioning the EU. So I'm completely with you, that on this ideological drive. But at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is 2 things. One is that on the UK side, at the end of the day, reality bites. And once COVID is less able to hide the costs, once taxes need to come in for the big Keynesian projects of the UK government, there will be movement. Part of the question is whether the EU can play ball in not rubbing it in when there is some movement that, it helps on the UK side that makes it more compatible. So Richard was talking about data adequacy. And you're talking about, it's really interesting, Richard, testing that line. Not surprising, but I guess on the EU side, yes, there is a point where that line is unacceptable if it really is beyond the GDPR principles on privacy. On the other hand, is the EU prepared to consider that in a world of AI, in a world where Europe as a whole needs to be competitive, say, on AI, especially vis-a-vis China, it's kind of okay if the UK experiments a bit? There might be a kind of relationship like that, where the UK experiments and the EU learns from UK mistakes as well as UK successes. That our mindset in the EU starts to be like that. Now, I'm not saying this is always acceptable experiment. If suddenly the UK, for the sake of, huge progress on AI, overlooks completely every privacy requirement, I'm with you. But it doesn't look like it from the UK side. But, let's see. How do we manage that fine line together in an open spirit? And I agree with everyone on the panel that it's hard when you have a government just always speaking ideology for the sake of provocation sometimes. It's kind of like, no, I don't want to be nice to you guys. And Richard, interestingly, when you ended your response on the breadth, why not, where I was pushing you, why not plug in? And you ended saying, well, given the overall political atmospherics, that I'm citing you, And that I get that, you know, it is very annoying. But even on the EU side, isn't there a need to, beyond the political atmospheric, look at the horizon and see how this could be also reset, this relationship, in a way where the UK playing with fire can be kind of channeled. And I say this because one thing I always like to remind everyone is that Brexit, yes, we have to show that it's costly to be out, got that. The UK overinterprets the EU on that. Yes, but at the same time, let's remember that the biggest gift of Brexit is to demonstrate to the world that the EU is not a prison, that it's not like the United States 1865. Wow, that's super cool. You can leave the EU. Personally, I hate Britain leaving the EU. I'm a passionate Remainer. But I think we need to also see that other side of the coin and maybe then engage with the idea of Brexit as an experiment, even though we keep on being super annoyed by the provocative language and ideological language of this government.
Thanks, Kalypso. I'm not sure I'm any more optimistic. I don't know that if things are getting worse, whether the reaction of the UK government might not be exactly the opposite, rather than being constructive, making things more difficult. But that, I guess, we will see. I have a question for Richard, also from the audience, and then I want to bring in a couple of people who put up their hands. But the question really is about the link you've mentioned between the withdrawal agreement and the TCA. And in particular, if there is a move to trigger Article 16 from the UK, given that these are two separate legal agreements, what is the linkage which then can be made with the TCA?
Sure. So there are, so if I can, so first I'll address that. So there are, formally we see two linkages in between the withdrawal agreement and the TCA. The point I was making is that in my introduction is just these are two separate agreements, and kind of we see them as a single whole and the basis of our relationship with the UK. So we find it, we would find it a bit schizophrenic, if you like, to look at one, say on one side everything's fine, on the other we have a problem, but to keep those two things distinct. That was the point that I was making. Formally speaking, there are two connections. One is the one that I mentioned around good faith, where the TCA refers to previous agreements, i.e. to the withdrawal agreement in that context. And the second one, of course, is that if you go through the various channels of dispute resolution, a finding of violation, a ruling to comply, non-compliance with that ruling, ultimately you can end up in a logic where you can cross-retaliate for infringements of the withdrawal agreement under the TCA. We hope never to have to go down that route, of course. Then, I mean, Article 16, I mean, it's an area on which I wouldn't want to say too much because I don't think it's helpful to say too much about it at the moment. So it's a provision in the withdrawal agreement. Everybody agrees that it's framed by a certain number of conditions, and I think the language that the Vice President has always used on this point, that we'd have a serious problem if the UK triggered Article 16 as a way of exerting pressure on the EU to renegotiate the protocol. And this is the point that I made also in response to Kalypso and her previous comment. Then there are two additional points that I wanted to work. The first one is that unlike a free trade agreement, the protocol is actually extremely prescriptive as to how it's meant to be implemented. You have an annex with all the elements of the EU acquis on the free movement of goods that need to be implemented by the UK. And so when I said that we knew the implementation would be difficult, it's because we understood what the UK would need to do to implement it, and understood that that would be difficult to put in place. But what the UK is actually meant to do is extremely clear, because it's much more prescriptive than FTAs, because of this reel of free market of goods legislation that needs to come in. So when the withdrawal agreement and the protocol was signed up to, the UK interlocutors knew exactly what they were getting into. Then I agree with you, Fabian, that a lot of the difficulty will come potentially through the notion of divergence, and in particular when certificates have to be delivered for example, an operator to be able to put goods in the market in Great Britain and in Northern Ireland. And so we can't, we want to find solutions which are durable. That's the spirit with which we put the non-papers of mid-October on the table, but we're aware of the fact that should the UK government choose to refuse alignment as part of the solutions, at least in some areas, which seems to be the position of the UK government, and if they do decide to diverge, then it could create difficulties on the side of the protocol. The point that I would make is that both of those are choices of the UK government. They could choose to accept principles of alignment in some areas. They could choose not to diverge, but it's only if they go down those various routes that we'll end up with problems. But again, it's a question of the UK government accepting the consequences of the decisions that it's taken.
Thanks, Richard. I'm gonna ask one broad question summarizing quite a few questions which have been put in the Q&A, which is really about the broader relationship, the involvement of different actors in this, including local and regional authorities, including the Parliamentary Assembly, the Domestic Advisory Group. Where do all of you see the role of other actors than governments, commission in this process? And I'll also get a couple of questions from the audience before I come back to you, and then you can pick and choose what you want to respond to. John Palmer, if you would want to come in.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd be interested to know the panel's reaction to whether they see significance in recent but rather striking developments on this side of the channel. I speak from London, and that is the fact that Northern Ireland business has declared itself overwhelmingly in favour of the protocol, that the statistics from Northern Ireland, the statistics from UK business with the European Union, the region with the fastest net rate of growth is the north of Ireland. And that thirdly, one of the more intransigent parties in Northern Ireland, the Democratic Unionists, have undergone a 80-degree turn, 90-degree turn, insofar as they have withdrawn their threat to collapse the peace agreement if the existing protocol broadly remains in place and the controls remain in place across the Irish Sea. I'm saying all of this because I think that the pressures are growing on Boris Johnson's government. The rise of other people in the government who are aware of what is happening, I think shouldn't be missed on your side of the channel. So although I share normally Fabian's more or less gloom about anything to do with negotiations with the British, I see recent developments as marking quite an important turn. It rather suggests that the Commission should hold its position with more confidence.
Thanks, John. And I'll bring in Tanya Buzek as well.
I hope you can hear me, Fabian.
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and I wanted to compliment to Richard's vast overview on where we do stand with the implementation. I would like to come in as the chair of the newly established EUIdea on the TCA. We had our first meeting end of November. And I think it is important also to see as our first and primary task how we're going to establish the channels, in particular with you, Richard, with all the colleagues in the UK services, because this must not be a one-way road. We really need to have a two-way highway on that, in particular because, as you said yourself, the breadth of the agreement, this is a challenging task for us because it's for the first time ever that we are going to monitor the entire agreement. So far, we only have the experience with the trade and sustainable development chapter, so it's for us also a new experience. But nonetheless, we are a very big group. We are a group of 30 DAG members, and even behind that, we have gathered so much interest in the work of the DAG that we need to manage all the expertise that we have. And of course, for us, it is important to channel everything. And just to feed back to you, the first discussion that we had, we touched ground, of course, with Commission services, and on the priorities list, of course, is on our side the commitment to do everything to work on a good implementation of the agreement, of course, in particular focusing on the priorities of trade, fisheries, as it was already mentioned, governance, also the participation in union programs. But beyond that, on the high priorities, of course, monitoring everything market access with goods and services. But as you already said, of course, the level playing field, whether it is, to environmental side, social workers' rights, this is going to be a huge challenge for us. And also then to monitor the proper enforcement of those provisions, where there is also a particular role foreseen for the DAG. And as was mentioned, also a lot of reference to Ireland, Northern Ireland. Of course, we do see also the implications for Northern Ireland and Ireland when it comes to monitoring the TCA implementation. So I just wanted to say that, we are here, we're up and running, and we take this task very seriously, and we will depend on having good relationships, of course, with the services, but in particular also with the specialized committees, because this is the in-depth that you had mentioned beyond the broadness. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And please, all the panelists, feel free to react to the comments and questions. I'll start with Kalypso this time.
I think your question, Fabian, is so important, involvement of other actors, and in fact echoed by the other two questions. To John, I myself stated that I think that, the polls on lack of trust of the UK government in Northern Ireland, especially by business, are telling that there is a gap there, and part of that gap needs to be occupied with a greater voice of local business, indeed. But I think that there is also this question that Šefčovič actually, when he was in Stormont, raised, and the Commission has continued to push, which is that, first of all, the engagement with the Northern Ireland Assembly at the margin of the UK-EU Parliamentary Forum. But of course, that's in the gift of the UK government, which has not allowed for seats in the by the devolved regions. So that's one area. And then there is also a lot of, from what I know from civil society in Northern Ireland, a lot of hope from the structured civil society engagement that the EU does actually with civil society groups in other agreements. Mostly we see it from Korea to many others. So this can be done much more systematically and is being discussed now. And also apparently, I think on the UK side, I think Frost and others think this is relatively harmless. I don't hear that they're against it. They just don't concentrate enough on it. But the underlying question is, of course, the Good Friday Agreement. And there were big debates on involvement of civil society, especially in Strand 1. So the internal, and then north-south, and of course, east-west. So you have this, in my view, and we were saying, many of us were saying this before the final TCA, is that, and the Northern Ireland Protocol, there was not enough attention paid to leveraging the three strands of the Good Friday Agreement, and especially the North-South, to really bring in, business, civil society in a much more systematic way. And only now do we see this. So it's a kind of irony, because yes, the whole story is a challenge for the Good Friday Agreement, but in a way it could also allow it to renew the thinking on North and South Ireland. But of course, we know that there are political issues on this, but as John reminded us, they can be overcome. And I think the most extremists in Northern Ireland understand that they can't forever object to involvement of Trans-Ireland civil society group in this whole story.
Thanks. Anna, do you want to come?
Yes, thank you. So I'll start with John's question or comment. I think the recent developments were very interesting. The well, not increasing, but the continuous pressure from the US is also a very interesting factor here. Perhaps not fully appreciated in the UK, but it's an ongoing element of the discussion. The kind of the survey and the recent polls, and there's been some amazing work in that field. I try to generally not comment on the opinions and feelings in Northern Ireland and leave it to people much more qualified like Katie Hayward and others. But from my own personal experience, I've never met a company that listed the role of ECJ or the governance of the protocol as their main concern. And I think, for businesses, again, it's how you implement this on the ground, how you make it work, how you make the rules simple, transparent. So much of such a big part of trade barriers isn't even around barriers. It's about the lack of transparency in terms of what's required in terms of rules. Even just as, and I keep repeating that in various conversations, even just as much as clarifying the requirements, providing better guidance, simplifying the implementation side of the protocol, even that would have an incredible beneficial impact. So it's and again, engaging with the recent proposal and engaging with practical solutions and practical ideas that actually, as far as I understand, come from the stakeholders on the ground, not only businesses, but various groups on the ground. There was this, early on when we started talking about the protocol, there was this notion that Northern Ireland will have the best of both worlds. That, with the difficulties around the protocol, obviously kind of, that's not how it developed in the first year of that relationship, but there's still potential for that to be the case. So I think it's quite significant what's happening, and hopefully we'll move past the issue of governance at some point soon and start looking at the solutions. And then just very quickly to your question, Fabian, about other ways of solving issues than government to government. And it's slightly different because I'm not talking here about stakeholders or groups, civil society groups, but from my own kind of customs focused perspective, implementation of these trade agreements or any trade agreements always works best when the politics don't get in the way. And when you pass the stage of negotiating the agreement, announcing the agreement, signing the agreement, and all the kind of official side of that, and you get the people working with people, so customs officers with customs officers, companies with companies, that's when you iron out all these difficulties. That's when you get these agreements to work. And we've actually had some really positive signals about how this could potentially work going forward during this year. We've had some cases where we had difficulties with implementation in some EU member states that were raised by companies. We had HMRC stepping in, discussing with local customs authorities. And when you do it on that level without the political difficulties attached to it, the problems can be resolved within days. And what used to be a challenge for companies now works well. So we've seen some very good signs when it comes to how you can do it on a kind of less official authorities to authorities, companies to companies, businesses to businesses level. So I think that would be a good way forward as well.
Thanks very much, Richard.
Thanks very much. So first of all, on the points on the Northern Ireland protocol. So we, as a commission, and the Vice President, first and foremost, has always made the case about the potential benefits of the protocol, and so to the need for kind of providing stability and certainty for businesses in Northern Ireland and for citizens in Northern Ireland. And that's why we never really liked this notion of grace period, because we think that what's needed is just a shared understanding of that there will be a proper implementation of the protocol, for this not to be questioned, because if we think that the Northern Ireland Protocol can unlock investment in Northern Ireland, and we believe that it will, then that'll only happen if you have predictability and certainty. Of course, we know the position of businesses. If I think about this kind of reasonably, I have to recognize that overall, yes, businesses are absolutely in favor, but it depends a bit on the pre-existing business model of the business. If you have a company which has always been busy trading with the internal market on the island of Ireland, then of course the protocol is hugely to its advantage. If you have a business which is focused exclusively on relations between GB and NI, then the protocol does not facilitate its life. And that's the reality of it. And that's why what we've tried to do and with this phrase of, you know, the best of both worlds, is to make sure that the protocol is implemented in such a way that Northern Ireland has the access that it's meant to have to the single market for goods, and mitigate the impact of the protocol on businesses active between GB and NI. And that was the purpose of the package that we put down, that we presented on the 13th of October. I mean, what we recognize is that you know, we've kind of had this very, very constructive discussion kind of amongst each other, but there are also voices who say, well, why should the EU tolerate the non-implementation of an agreement for a longer period of time? And this, I noticed, was the point made by Lars, for example, in the chat, in which, in fact, we've heard from many others, and which is an absolutely valid point. So that's why, for example, in the area of medicines, we're trying to act with urgency, and we said that we want this issue to be resolved before the end of the year, and we're determined to make that happen, because we agree that we need to act with a sense of kind of speed, urgency, because ultimately this is about the internal market. We don't want we don't want the current situation, which is not satisfactory, to be taken as permanent. And ultimately, we will need to make sure that the rules which have been agreed to are enforced. Then on how seriously we take engagement with stakeholders, and this is very important, as I mentioned right at the beginning. On the Northern Ireland Protocol, the package that we presented on the 13th of October was specifically in response to the requests of stakeholders, which Vice President Šefčovič kind of heard when he was in Northern Ireland at the beginning of September. Of course, some of those are a lot of that we hear also from the UK government, but kind of he has been guided by what stakeholders have been telling him. And indeed, on issues like the Court of Justice, there are a number of reasons why that wasn't in the package that we presented. But one of them is because, as Anya and others have said, it's simply not raised by businesses and by citizens. But that's not to say that it's not raised by anybody. it's in the same kind of spirit that we'll approach kind of the stakeholder element under the TCA. Indeed, it's very good that we've spent 2021 setting up the various structures which are established by the TCA and are meant to give the TCA life. A very, very important part of that is the domestic advisory group. We're very grateful to all the colleagues involved, and Tanya, of course, first and foremost, that the first meeting could take place at the end of last month. The next step is that there's a civil society forum which also meets, and I think that the domestic advisory group will accompany that as it moves forward. From our side, that's run very much by DG Trade, who've got enormous expertise in running such such processes, such discussions, but then we have a kind of an internal system to disseminate the information and to put whatever's agreed into practice. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are getting close to the end of the event. There have been a number of things mentioned which would have deserved a longer discussion, but I'm sure this is also a topic which is not going to go away. So I'm sure we will be returning to this in the next year as well, and maybe in a year's time we can all come back together and see whether our optimism or pessimism has been justified or not. I think one question which was raised in the chat was the question about unity and whether it is the EU or the UK which risk their own internal unity more within this process. I think from my perspective, we've clearly seen that up to this point, the unity in the EU has been holding to some surprise, because that was not necessarily what was expected at the beginning, whereas what we've seen on the UK side has been a fragmentation also of different interests, of different approaches to this. I think that is also going to be true going forward, at least in the short run. I think the question of what the long run will bring, also in terms of a challenge to EU unity, is still an open question, especially once these immediate economic difficulties start to be swamped by other economic developments. But certainly also in the short run, unfortunately, I've not become more optimistic. I think there is a temptation that if you are in trouble at home, the best thing to do is to not start a fight, but continue a fight with someone which is external, especially if your own party pushes you in that direction. So I think what we are going to see is the continuation of domestic politics overriding the considerations of the longer term relationship, at least on the UK side. I want to thank all of the panelists very much for taking the time to having this discussion with us today. I also want to thank the audience. As I said, always a good interest in Brexit, and I'm glad we could continue that discussion. And I'm sure we will return to it. So hope to see you soon at an EPC event. Thanks very much.